Today's presentation moves between personal narrative, art history, and sociology. I address my personal relationship to the window of the Good Samaritan, uh, its art historical transformation, and its sociological paradox. Finally, I argue that this one specific stained glass window embodies a paradox between the moral message of the Good Samaritan parable and the historically insular community that houses it. As I said, this is very much a personal talk. As a 6-year-old, I went to this church. And as a 6-year-old in this church, if I sat there on the left, underneath the stained glass window of the Good Samaritan, and participated in the children's choir, I received a little piece of paper. It looked a lot like a fortune from a Chinese cookie. And what it did was give me a free ice cream cone. So you can be sure that I went to the children's choir to get my free ice cream cone. I, however, like the illiterate folks from the Middle Ages, did not know how to read, so I had to memorize the hymns. And really all I could see was this stained glass window, which was at the center of the church, which was in the center of the community. This is the photograph I have of the window. I went to the community archives and there's no decent image. And so at some point in the future, I'm going to try to get a professional photograph of it, but it's not exactly publicly available. So what I first would like to do is discuss the stained glass window, or second, in terms of the art historical context, and look at the idea of sources for art in general. When I grew up, or more specifically, when I graduated from college, I decided to become an art historian, to the dismay of my father. And that made me think about ideas like sources for images. What is the source for art? And we can certainly consider 5 to 6 possibilities. One, of course, is the Bible itself. And as I looked at the window, I eventually came to know that it was based on the parable, but I really didn't think that much about that. As an art historian, I started to think about, where do images come from? Our imagination, memory, longing, loss, nature perfected, the idea of a Platonic ideal, one surrounding nature itself, mechanical reproduction and graphic modernism, footnote here to Richard Bertel, literature, the Bible, and of course, other art. All of these might be connected to that one stained glass window. Here I show you a 1785 painting by Jean-Baptiste Reynaud, The Origin of Painting, which is at Versailles. And of course, this is representing one of the origin myths of art, that a lover was rendering an image of her beloved in hopes to hang on to him, right? Not lose him. So this is the idea of longing, aspiration, which of course is also part of the parable. As we heard earlier, it can sometimes be difficult to recognize that the neighbor is anybody. So in that sense, it's an aspirational activity. Then there's the idea that art comes from perfecting nature. We certainly see this in Polyclitus' The Spear Bearer. This, of course, is a 2nd century BC copy of a 5th century Greek sculpture, and it's in Naples, Italy, in the National Archaeological Museum. And in the stained glass window, while the Samaritan remains somewhat naturalistic, the surrounding landscape in its rich blues and greens is somewhat idealized. Then in the 19th century, you have a paradigmatic shift where the idea of perfecting nature is changed, and Gustave Courbet turns the notion of truth and beauty to reality itself, to nature itself. And in this painting of the young ladies by the banks of the Seine, he turns to the decadence of Second Empire Paris and shows two, in quotation marks, young ladies of questionable repute lounging by the banks of the Seine, one of whom has actually removed her dress and is using it as a pillow. This was hardly proper decorum for 1857. Um, and then the idea of mechanical reproduction. In Manet's The Bar at the Folies Bergères from 1882, which is in the Courtauld in London, in the foreground you will see champagne bottles, and you'll see a design on the champagne bottle. That, of course, would not have been something that Manet made up. This came from graphic designs that existed in the late 19th century, and we then see them in this painting, which is notable for many, many reasons as well. But again, this is Bretel's idea of graphic modernism. And as we'll see in the stained glass window of the Good Samaritan, mechanical reproduction plays a role as well. And literature. So we have the parable. This was a text I found online. It's not the version I would normally use. And since nobody has read it yet, I thought maybe it would be read during the introduction. I thought I'd just go through the passage. Verse 30, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell upon robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." So my research is actually on Gustave Courbet. And I was in the process of researching Courbet. That particular painting of the 2 ladies on the banks of the Seine is at the bottom of the Champs-Élysées in Paris, opposite the Grand Palais, which is iconic. Many of you recognize it. The young ladies on the banks of the Seine is in the Petit Palais, which is across the street. So I go into the gallery, the main gallery, which, by the way, is free. So if you're in Paris and you don't want to deal with all the complicated ticket business, you can go here for free. So I find my painting, very happy, and I wander around the gallery. I cannot impart to you how shocked I was when in an alcove in the same gallery, I find this image. And I'm like, OMG. What is this doing here? I thought this was the stained glass window in this private summer community off the shore of Long Island. What? Hello? So clearly a photograph was made of this image, and it became part of the design program for the stained glass window. This is a better slide, not the one I took in the museum. And I want to bring your attention to the hoofs of the donkey, the feet of the Samaritan, that little bit of water in the foreground. Should you have any doubt that the stained glass window is securely based on that painting. Here's the wall label from the museum. And basically, my rough translation is Aimé Moreau, The Good Samaritan, 1880, oil on canvas, winning the Prix de Rome in 1873. Moreau was inspired by the Gospel according to St. Luke and painted the Good Samaritan. During a trip to the Villa Medici, his painting was shipped to Paris for the French Salon, or the Salon of French Artists, where it received a recognition and a Medal of Honor. It was largely noted for the influence of 17th century Spanish art. Moreau treated the parable of the Samaritan receiving the wounded, the room, excuse me. Moreau treated the parable of the Samaritan helping the wounded with grave realism. His vigorous style pleased the critics of his time, and they celebrated the virtuosity of this little painting. So this is an example of 17th century Spanish realism, and as you can see, it's much gentler than the harsh quality, really, of the Moreau painting, which is more severe, I would say, than the Spanish realism. Here's another little detail of the background. And then if we turn to another slide from the archives of Point of Woods, you can see that the background here is radically changed. It has this lush green and blue colors in the stained glass. Very different from the painting. Parenthetically, I have to say, when I saw the painting, I went, wait a minute. I know that stained glass window does not have male frontal nudity. I have to check. But everything else fit beautifully. So just to recap the art historical aspect of this, we see a 17th century Spanish style painted in Italy, then the painting itself exhibited in Paris, and then copied in a completely different style for a summer church in New York. Now, I'd like to shift gears and go into the sociological context of this. So personal, art historical, sociological. Point of Woods is a very particular place with a curious history. Originally, Point of Woods was a Chautauqua society from 1894 to 1898. There are still quite a few Chautauqua societies in existence. This was a short-lived one from 1894 to 1898. It was initially for Methodist Sunday school teachers. It celebrated arts, education, religion, recreation. It was also the home of major figures in the women's rights movement. I'm thinking specifically of one Lily Devereaux Blake, who was the runner-up to Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony parenthetically won out because she said, we're just going to focus on the vote. Lily Devereaux Blake was much more interested in women's rights across the board. So not just getting the vote, but equal rights. And she lost out to Susan B. Anthony and then receded. But she was part of the Chautauqua Society. She built a house there. And when in 1898, the Point of Woods Association purchased the charter, they also got Lily Devereaux Blake. She owned a house there and they couldn't get rid of her. As time went by, Point of Woods became very much for nuclear families, traditional nuclear families. It did maintain a lot of the original Chautauqua Society values, so volunteerism, a recreation, sports, emphasis on religion, temperance. The charter came with a no alcohol consumption line, which actually only changed 5 years ago. In general, it became much more conservative than progressive. It became decidedly private as opposed to public, which it had been as part of the Chautauqua Society initially. Now, a terrible, terrible, horrific event transpired in September of 1883. there was a fire. The fire burned 4 houses in Point of Woods to the ground. 3 people died. Ironically, one of them was the head of the Women's Studies program at Columbia University. And it was really a nightmare. And following the fire, which was in the New York Times, this is from the Times, it was also covered in the New York Post, the idea of who is thy neighbor shifted. One of the reasons that the fire couldn't be contained was because Point of Woods had become so isolated that they didn't talk to the neighboring communities, and none of the fire equipment, none of the hoses matched the hardware. So the houses just burned. There was an inability to respond. As a result of the fire, it became paramount that this notion of neighbor change. And Point of Woods created an intercommunity fire association where they actually communicated with the people nearby. They also opened up their Sayer lecture series to the entire community. The lecture series is always about something having to do with the island or some broader cultural idea. And so this terrible event changed the idea of what constituted nature and how Point of Woods thought about it. Casting the net wider, and certainly in relation to what we're doing today, right now, we are caught between isolationism and a worldview that insists we are only as strong as our weakest link. This tension is philosophical, economic, sociological, religious, with, I would say, humanity itself hanging in the balance. Reflecting on the Good Samaritan window now takes on not a new, but a highly charged meaning. It exemplifies art historical transformation and a pressing moral narrative that challenges insularity and asks insistently, who is thy neighbor? Thank you.